Hi, Mr. Godfrey here, and in this video we want to look at how we can remove fractions from an equation. Although we spent some time learning how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions, which are skills we need to know, many times when solving an equation it's a little bit easier to work with integers. So if there were a way, and there is, to remove the fractions from the equation, then we would want to do that. Now, there's three things we want to remember when we're doing this. First of all, we cannot remove the fractions until all the parentheses have been removed, or grouping symbols. So we are going to have to distribute first. So if we have fractions and there are parentheses in the equation, we will have to multiply those fractions first, removing the parentheses. Then we can go and remove the fractions. The way we're going to do that is to determine the least common multiple of our denominator. So we're going to find the common denominator, so to speak, of the fractions. But rather than changing all the fractions into fractions with common denominators, we're going to apply the multiplication property of equality. Now, the multiplication property of equality we're going to use a lot when we get to elimination, but we're going to use it here too. Says that we can take an equation, and if we multiply every term in that equation by a number, therefore changing the terms, as long as we do it to every single term, we're going to create an equivalent equation, or equation that has the same value as the original. So by multiplying everything by the same number, we don't change the equation, we simply change what it looks like. So we're going to use those three things, all of which we already know how to do, and use that to our advantage to take an equation that has fractions in it and remove the fractions from that. So let's take a look at an example, and then you'll see what I mean. So in this equation we have 5/3 plus 4/3 x is equal to 5/2 plus 1/3 times the quantity x minus 5/2. Now that's a lot of fractions, and we could determine the least common multiple and get common denominators, but let's remove the fractions. So as I said, the first thing is we have to remove the parentheses. So we have to distribute over here first. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're not going to do anything to this side of the equation over here. We still are going to have our 5/2. Now 1/3 times 1x is 1/3 x, and then 1/3 times 5/2 is negative 5/6. So now that the parentheses are gone, what we want to do is determine the least common multiple of the denominator. So in essence, imagine or pretend that we are going to find the common denominator, turn them all into fractions with the same denominators, and add them. I have a denominator here of 3, another denominator of 3, 2, 3, and 6. So my least common multiple will be 6. But rather than changing all of these fractions into denominators of 6, we are going to multiply every single term in the equation by the number 6. Okay? And if you remember from our multiplying of fractions, we can pre-reduce. And because this 6 is a common multiple of all of those denominators, the 6 is going to pre-reduce with every single denominator, turning the denominator into a 1. Every single denominator will reduce to a 1 because we're multiplying by a number that every denominator divides evenly into. So if everything has a denominator of 1, those are all integers. So in this first fraction, the 3 is divisible by 3, and the 6 is divisible by 3. Leaving 2, so 2 times 5 is 10, over 1, which is just 10. The second term, the 3 is divisible by 3, the 6 is divisible by 3, leaving me 2 times 4, which is 8x over 1, which is just 8x. This next fraction, the 2 is divisible by 2, the 6 is divisible, this doesn't like to make a vertical stroke, the 6 is divisible by 2, leaving me 3 times 5, which is 15. 3 is divisible by 3, the 6 is divisible by 3, leaving me 2 times 1, which is 2x. The 6 is divisible by 6, and this is divisible by 6, leaving me 1 times 5, which is 5. So you'll notice now that because we chose a multiple of all of the denominators, every single denominator reduced to a value of 1, meaning I don't have any more fractions. So now I can solve this equation the rest of the way without having to worry about fractions and getting those denominators mixed up. So if we subtract, if we simplify each side first by adding like terms, we get 15 minus 5 over here. So it's going to be 10. Now we can subtract 2x from both sides, and then subtract 10 from both sides, and then divide by 6, so I get a value of 0, so my answer is 0. So this part of solving the equation becomes much easier because we don't have any fractions to deal with. So we can remove fractions from equations by first making sure we take care of our parentheses. We then determine the least common multiple and apply the mathematical property, multiplication property of equality, which says we can multiply an equation by any number we want. We chose 6. And as long as we do it to every term in the equation, we're going to be okay. So the only tricky part about that is to remember that you have to multiply every single term. Many times students will, as they're doing this, will only multiply the terms in the equation that have fractions, and if there are other terms that aren't fractions, they won't multiply them by that number. And that's a mistake, because the property of equality says you have to do it to every single term. So even though you're just trying to get rid of fractions, you can't do it to just fractions. You got to do it to everything. Okay? So that's how you remove fractions. In the next video, I'll do a few examples from the worksheet, and that'll wrap up this assignment.